how economic empowerment and freedom defeats extremism and authoritarianism. Okay? So for this point, I'd like to start off with a personal experience of mine, how economic freedom made a profound difference in some people's lives. I did some research in India one time, in Sagat village in Gujarat in India, and utilizing the ideas of the Fraser Institute, a nice Canadian institution that established the Economic Freedom of the World Index. They set out 5 criteria for evaluating how free economies are. One of which is the size of government, their level of spending, taxation, fiscal responsibility. Another was how secure are property rights and contracts, which is often not the case in many countries of the world. Another is sound money. How sound is the monetary policy. Free trade, opening our people to trade with others around the world. And regulatory restraint, how constrained people are by their own governments in conducting proper economic activity. Well, one concept with regard to secure property rights is something that's quite sketchy in a lot of parts of the world. Even in the United States, there are thousands of cases where eminent domain is exercised. Now, eminent domain comes from the Latin for superior owner. Now, the government may say, you're the property owner, but we, as the government, are the superior owner if we choose to take it for some public good as we choose. And often they exercise this. I was told by people at the Institute for Justice that the number one user of this, taking private property from one person and giving it to another person for a higher public purpose, is Costco. But there are a lot of other companies and businesses that utilize their local governments to take property. In some countries, as in the case in China, this can be quite a deadly thing to resist. And in all cases, it's problematic because you're taking property that is valued by someone more than they're being offered voluntarily to give it up. Well, this case in India started actually with the British occupation. The empire in India, during that time of rule, the British government decided to have national parks. They said, well, this is a public good, we're going to take this property and make it into a national domain. The problem was that there were thousands, millions of people, tribal villagers all throughout India who were living and working on those properties for centuries. And they didn't like that, being kicked off their own land to make for a national park. Now, the benefit to the government of having a national park is that they could hand out contracts to their favorite friends and cronies to sell the bamboo or to develop the resources at great personal gain to themselves. But for the villagers, it was devastating. When they tried to build houses, they were torn down. When they tried to plant crops, they were torn down. When they tried to raise cattle, well, they were often just taken from them, saying, you don't belong here. In fact, their penalty would often be to be made to do forced labor in building the roads or repairing the roads for the national park. These people lived at a bare existence of life, living on tubers and roots to eke out a living which was very, very harsh and as impoverished as one could possibly imagine. Well, there was one time when a woman named Truti Mehta and her husband Amrish Mehta, she was a lawyer, he was an engineer, decided to try and help out the villagers. When the government took 6 cattle from one village in Sagai, 300 of the villagers went down to the park office and demanded those cattle back. And the officials said, well, we can't say anything about it, or the top official isn't here. So they just took the cattle back. For that, Truti was arrested and sent to prison. And many of the people who helped her as well. Well, but she was well-educated lawyer, able to challenge this case in the courts. and in the public arena, the media. And transparency makes a very, very big difference when faced with authoritarian actions. Well, in her case, the publicity was enough to get the state assembly, the state legislature, to challenge this by passing a law which would placate the villagers and the general public. If the villagers could prove that they had been working this land, well, they could be given title to it and the right to develop it. But they knew that there was really no way that they could prove it. In fact, 98% of all the villagers who tried to prove their title to the land were turned down. That's not proof. We need something hard and concrete. Fortunately, Ambrish developed a great scheme. He noticed that Google had photographed all the world, and along with that, Gujarat province. So they had Google Maps for this. And then he had, for about $1 each, he got handheld GPS devices and handed them to the farmers so they could walk around the territory of the land that they had been working for centuries and mark out plots on this map, which then was negotiated between all the other villagers. Yes, this is yours, that's yours, we're all in agreement. And then they took that to the officials. They had to accept it. They couldn't reject it. This actually fit the letter of the law. I like this point that was made earlier today. It's important to follow the law, but sometimes there's bad law. And in this case, they finally got the title to their land. Most all of them did. And it was a transformation. The importance of property rights is something that we take for granted mostly in developed economies. But for most of the third world, there is no such thing as title to the property for most of the population. The government owns most of it, and most of the action is informal. But it made a huge difference for these people. It meant that they could dig wells. As a coordinated community activity, they could then gather the water from several seasons. And then they could build the irrigation systems, the dams. They could build fences around their crops to protect them from wildlife. They could protect their houses, so they built substantial houses, and the second floor was their bank. It was the storage for the grain, so that in case they experienced famine or flood, they could live through the next 2 seasons with it. And they were earning enough money that they were able to buy cell phone devices, which allowed them not just to sell to the first merchant that came by and offered them whatever he wanted. Now, they could communicate all around the state, all around the country really, to find the best price and the best time to sell. They tremendously increased their income from this. And then, with this income, they educated their kids. Both the girls and the guys got an education for the first time in these villages. And they sent them off. They learned English so they could go to the universities. And they got professional training. So they came back as doctors and nurses and accountants and honest policemen who they knew and they could trust. It transformed their lives with motorcycles, and so they didn't have to depend on the weekly bus once a week to go into town. Now they could go whenever they needed to buy some goods for the household or to sell some goods. It was a transformation. And for this gentleman here in the middle, he told me the best thing of all, by having title to his own land, is that when he went into the office of the national park officials, instead of being kicked and beaten and pushed away, he was greeted with water and invited to come and sit down. He was treated as an equal, as an owner of his own land. So this kind of thing enabled them to now be a part of the democratic processes, a part of the information process, the educational processes, all in India, in this province and region. Okay, why do I mention all this? Well, property is really an important thing. I'd like to also mention that one of the fastest growing, well, the fastest growing country in Africa for about 30 years was Botswana. And it's argued by some that one of the primary reasons that it excelled from being the poorest country to now one of the wealthiest is because of their right to property, a traditional custom in that part of the world. Now, because I've been asked to show how this has transformed many authoritarian regimes, let me cite back, since I was born during the Cold War, and I'm guessing that I'm probably older than anyone in this room, so my memories of life growing up were of the Cold War era. And the kinds of things that were commonplace were, well, first, my hero, post-war, was, and I'm guessing, how many have ever heard of Ludwig Erhard? Good one. Please remember his name. I consider him a great hero because Germany, after World War II, reduced to rubble after an era of extreme authoritarianism. Now, it was in desperate poverty. The West was wondering, how could we prevent Western Germany from turning into East Germany and like all the other communist countries that appealed to people, well, we'll show you your rights, we'll show you prosperity, land, peace, and bread. Well, Ludwig Erhard transformed the economy of Germany, persuading Konrad Adenauer, the chancellor, he was the finance minister, Erhard was the finance minister, to radically free the markets of Germany. Ending price controls, lowering taxes, reducing regulations. His transformations consecutively over the next 10 years did such a remarkable job of building the economy of Germany that it became the economic miracle. It was at that time then, the burgeoning economic power of the Western world. And an example to the Eastern European countries, hey, communism isn't the only solution. Hey, this market stuff still seems to work. And I think that it did much to bolster the whole idea of democracy in the West, the success that they had. Then, because that was so successful, it was borrowed by Joe Dodge. Joe Dodge and Carl Schupf to go to Japan with the same idea. And they brought the same idea to Hayata Ikeda, who was the finance minister of Japan at the time, and they adopted a similar pattern of radical changes. This became the example that proved enormously influential for autocratic regimes to borrow free market changes. Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, Park Chung-hee in Korea, Francisco Franco in Spain, General Charles Elfie, he didn't accept this, but he knew that he had to make free market some changes in order to quell the solidarity movement. And Pinochet, who was the horrific general of Chile, he had to adopt these ideas of the Chicago Boys and free market ideas. What they implemented were a mix of market reforms in land, free trade, deregulation, privatization, fiscal and monetary restraint, currency decontrol, and free economic zones. Since then, their economies prospered, and those authoritarian regimes all crumbled. Now, some people say it was because of the aid they got from the United States. I contend not. There wasn't the social planning. I contend that those things lead to a distortion of the markets because it redirects people from productive economic activity to unproductive economic activity. It postpones essential reforms. It led to more and more corruption in those countries, which was a very, very authoritarian way of controlling the market, and a dependency on the United States or whoever is handing out the money. The reforms occurred in Taiwan when the US government stopped the economic aid, and it took off. And England got twice as much economic aid, Marshall Plan aid, as Germany. And yet, Germany succeeded where England didn't because their socialist policies and nationalization ran counter to economic prosperity. For further lessons in economic development, I suggest that of P.T. Bauer, Friedrich Hayek, Julian Simon, my favorites. There's a counter argument here. The growing authoritarianism also occurs when there is economic prosperity. And my wife will kindly illustrate that for you in how many authoritarian regimes use the prosperity of economic growth in order to turn it against their rivals, to turn it against the people who challenge them. So there are a number of cases here. I don't have time to go into the multiple avenues that free market reforms add to wealth and prosperity. But let me maybe sum it up in one thing. People with wealth have choices. Choices is your wealth, not the things you have, but the options you have in life. That's why we're wealthier than any of the kings and princes 100 years ago, because we have many more choices than they did. Even the poorest people in society do. And governments take those choices away. I like to point to this point here. A lot of people flee tyranny, and that shame in itself is hardship for governments. That's why they don't want people to flee. And that's why other oppressed regimes like China returns escapees to North Korea. Well, I'm reminded of an essay in the Brothers Karamazov, that basically a lesson. Do people really want freedom? That's the matter. So we have this choice. We have a choice of two kinds of freedom. One, for ourselves. We can find it. It's easier than changing the world and the government. Or for all. And that's the tough one. The toughest of all. Because then you're facing this challenge of fear versus courage. It takes a lot of courage to challenge, to stand up against authoritarianism. And a lot of fear can repress that. Well, my time's up. I'll thank you very much if you have any thoughts.